The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids. Today's guest is Jane Yolen, author of numerous children's books and recipient of the 1988 Kerlan Award, presented by the University of Minnesota in recognition of singular attainments in the creation of children's literature and an appreciation for generous donation of unique resources to the Kerlan Collection for the study of children's literature. Ms. Yolen is the author of Owl Moon, which received the American Library Association's 1988 Caldecott Award for illustration. Ms. Yolen will discuss her books with Marland Schrauth, librarian at St. Alphonsus School, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota.
We're very honored to have our distinguished guest, Jane Yolen, here in Minnesota with us today. Jane, can you tell us maybe a little bit about your personal life? You live in a farming community, and
I live in a small farming community in western Massachusetts. Actually, it's interesting for a small farming community that is fairly unbookish. We have 3 National Book Award nominees in the area, and we're in a 5-college area, so we have a lot of professionals and a lot of writers, a lot of artists around. We have a big old New England farmhouse and 15 acres, and it was a wonderful place to bring up children. I have 3 children.
you have 3 children, and your husband is at the college as a
professor of computer science.
And he's very supportive of you, coming with you to when you received the Kerlan Award.
He's wonderful. He's been one of the reasons that I've been able to write all the books that I've been able to write. He's always been encouraging, enthusiastic, critical, but in a positive way. And when I'd be in the middle of a book, he'd take the children off on a visit somewhere so that I could continue the writing.
Yeah. And your children, are they critical of your material, or do you give it to them to read? Or
I always felt that I had to write for the child inside of me, the child I was, who loved books, and I had to write the books that I had wanted to read as a child. My 3 children are very different in what they like to read. My oldest is a girl. She's into sort of romantic fiction now. My middle one, who lives here in Minneapolis, is one of those consummate and constant readers, but his favorite things are science fiction and fantasy. And the youngest one loves nonfiction. So there's no way I could have made all 3 of them happy at the same time. So I wrote for me and made me happy.
Tell me a little bit about the books that you read as a youngster.
Everything. If it had print, I read it. I think that certainly fantasy and fairy tales were a great deal of that. All the red, green, yellow, purple, orange fairy tale books. I loved Wind in the Willows. I loved the Jungle Books. But I also loved adventures. I was a great Treasure Island fan. And I loved home fiction. Louisa May Alcott, I read, I think, every book Louisa May Alcott ever wrote. And I also read bad stuff. I mean, I read a lot of Nancy Drew, a lot of the Bobbsey Twins. I don't think it seriously damaged me. Just, I always wanted to be reading.
So you were a voracious reader, really. And,
yes.
And that, did that in any way have anything to do with your writing? Did you, because you had read so widely, did you have an easy time starting your writing? Or?
I think that anyone who is a writer is a voracious reader. But some writers are very slow, voracious readers. I was one of these take it down in one great big gulp, stay up all night with a flashlight under the covers kind of reader. But I can't imagine being a writer without being a reader, because being a writer means you love stories and you love language.
When did you start writing? When did you, I'm sure it was early on.
I started really early, but you don't have to start early to be a writer. My best friend is Patricia McLaughlin, and she essentially started writing when she was 35 and took a class with me. But I was writing from first grade on. Of course, it was pretty awful stuff originally. I mean, my first poetry, which my mother saved. She was a wonderful supporter, but it was terrible stuff. It was a first grader's stuff. I was not any kind of genius. I was just someone who loved words.
When did you think about publishing your works or your writing for publication? During your editorship? Or?
Well, I think that I knew about publishing from very young because both my parents were writers, and my father had articles published, and all of their friends who would come home for dinner or whatever that I would get introduced to were published writers, people like Cornelius Ryan, who wrote The Longest Day, and Will Owsler, who wrote The Greatest Story Ever Told, and people like that were constant visitors at our house. So the idea that real, live human beings were writers and published was something that I understood. I mean, I meet a lot of children today who think that writers are all dead, and they're always surprised when they meet me and I'm alive. So that was always a viable option for me, to be published. And it was something I wanted, I think, quite desperately.
When you were, your first job was at the newspaper as a reporter, and you were, of course, writing then. Was that for your father? Or?
No, I was a cub reporter one summer on the Bridgeport Sunday Herald. And they started me off, as they did a lot of cub reporters, on the society pages. And I wrote more. I didn't even know what pas de soie was, but I kept on writing about brides wearing pas de soie. Until they finally gave me my big break. They were going to send me out on a big story. And they chose it very carefully. I think it was a way of showing me that being a reporter was not just sitting down and writing about pas de soie. They sent me out on a welfare story. And I'd come from a very sheltered, upper middle class existence. I didn't even know what welfare was, I think. And they threw me into a situation that I couldn't handle. That I came out of there having interviewed some of the elderly on welfare, sobbing. And I went back, and they didn't exactly laugh at me when I got back to the office, but it was their way of saying, you know, honey, this is the real world, and this is what we have to report. And it toughened me up in some ways, and in some ways opened me up. I hated it when it happened, and when I look back on it now, I think it was the very best way of becoming a writer.
How about your editorship? How did you write when you were editing too, or?
Yes, I did. I was writing at nights and on the weekends. In fact, my husband and I had very little social life because I would be writing, and he was a freelance photographer on his weekends. So we spent a lot of time working. Workaholics.
Workaholics, yes. What was your first book published, and how did you get it published?
Well, it was a fluke, really. I had been sending things around unsuccessfully, but I did go in to speak to an editor, and among the other ideas I had was one called Pirates in Petticoats. It was a synopsis of an idea about lady pirates. I made a kind of educated guess that I knew that there were 3, and I figured if there are 3, there are going to be more. And so I kind of talked my way into the book. I had had magazine articles published, and I had helped my father work on a book. So I had some credentials. And she, telling me all the way that she never started new people and she would never give a contract to someone who hadn't already had a book published, eventually gave me a contract just on this 2-page synopsis of a woman pirate book. And then when I started the research, I discovered that in fact there were many, and they were fascinating. So that was my first book.
You have a lot of strong feminine heroes or characters in your books too. Was that the first one, the first feminine character, do you think?
I think really, but I thought at that point I was a nonfiction writer, that I was a newspaper reporter, that what I could do best was writing articles, and Pirates in Petticoats was really a series of articles on famous women pirates. But in fact, I did a lot of fictionalizing because it seemed to me that for children, rather than just reporting the facts, if I told them the facts within a story, that it would be more palatable. So really my fiction started there as well.
Well, It certainly was, and your imagination. Your imaginative fairy tales, for example. Some of the fairy tales that came right out of your head. You know, usually you find retold tales so often, but yours are all original. And where did you get the ideas for your fairy tales? Some of them. Can you think of a specific?
Well, they come. I think that all stories come from two places. I think that the first place is something that you can recognize, something physical. You read an article, or you see a painting, or you hear a piece of music. Is a physical beginning. But then there has to be some answering emotion inside, something that you're wrestling with.
Like imagination?
No,
Using
like
your
a
imagination?
Hurt, like a hurt, like a problem in your life.
In other words, you're feeling it.
That's right. And then you have to take that physical thing that's become a metaphor and the emotional thing that you're wrestling with. And the two things come together. When they come together, the story begins. I like to tell my writing students that there's a Japanese word from Zen, a Zen word, called saku taku no ki. And saku is the sound of the mother hen pecking on the outside of the egg, and taku is the baby chick on the inside of the egg. And no ki is the moment when they come together. And that's when the new life emerges, saku taku no ki, that moment. And that's how stories start.
That's very interesting. I can see where you're coming from with that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the things you've written, the fairy tales, the Commander Toad, and then the fantasy that you've written? I mean, it reaches different levels of children and adults. And
well, I get people asking me all the time, how can you do so many different things? How can you have so many different voices? I've even had some librarians say, we don't know where to shelve you. And I say, that's your problem. That's not my problem. But in my daily life, I do, as everyone does, I am at turns serious and silly, happy, sad. So I reflect all those in my fictions. Commander Toad, I love puns, and I love science fiction. And I wanted to kind of poke gentle fun at Star Wars and Star Trek, which I love.
Yes.
I mean, I'm a Star Wars and Star Trek fan. And in fact, Mark Hamill has for his little boy, he has all the Commander Toad books.
Star Wars.
All the Star Wars crew. The fairy tales come from a very special emotional center for me. And those of all the books are the ones that I can least decide I'm going to do. Commander Toad, I can sit down and say, I've got 3 wonderful puns and I'm going to put them in a book. But with the fairy tales, I have to wait till they happen. And with the fantasy novels, it usually is some sort of little small vision that begins it. I just finished and will have published this fall a book called The Devil's Arithmetic. And it's a time travel novel about a young Jewish girl who goes from today, who goes back in time to the time of the concentration camps, the time of the Holocaust. And that began, well, because I am Jewish, but also because the one thing that I could never deal with, that I could never wrestle with, that I could never understand were the concentration camps, the Holocaust, how people could put other people in those conditions, how they could live with themselves, and how to explain it to children today. I was in Indianapolis and I had some 8th graders say to me, we were talking about history and we got on the subject of the concentration camps, and I told them something about it, and one 8th grade boy said to me, are you making this up? And I was part way through writing The Devil's Arithmetic at that moment, and I thought to myself, I'm going to finish this book. This book has to be written so that all the kids who say, are you making this stuff up, will know that I'm not.
That it was really
that
true.
It really happened. We have very quick forgetteries, very bad memories.
You have mentioned that King Arthur was quite an influence on some of your fantasy that you've written. Give us a little rundown on Dragon's Blood, where you're coming from with
Well, the only thing from King Arthur, I think, that comes into Dragon's Blood
that? Is Marland?
Well, no, Dragon's Blood is is the Fumets. It came out of T.H. White's the Once and Future King books. But dragons, which come out of the medieval fantasy, I wanted to update them and make them more real. Very often, dragons are just described in terms of the fantastic. So my husband at that point, who's a bird watcher, was doing some research on early birds and how these enormous birds actually got up in the air. I call it bird archaeology because he was taking a course in the bones and the stuff that were found in rocks and fossilized. And so it was explaining it to me. He always gives me my scientific knowledge. He explains it to me. And together we built the dragons in the Pit Dragon series so that they could actually fly. Wow. They have pneumatic bones, which means that hollow bones, and they're warm-blooded because they're more bird-like than they are lizard-like. And the flight muscles, the description of the flight muscles and when they're attached, it really makes more sense than sticking just two wings on the back, because that would never be able to get an enormous creature up into the air.
Did you have anything to do with the filming of that book?
No.
You let them do it all, huh?
Well, when you sell something to the movies, most of the time you give up all your control and power on it, and they changed everything. They changed the girl dragon to a boy dragon. They changed, the dragons no longer fight with their claws or draw blood, because you can't show blood on Saturday morning TV. I bet you didn't know that.
No, I didn't know that. But
so they had them fighting with antlers. Now, I have never known dragons with antlers, but these dragons had antlers. And they managed to kill a number of things in the cartoon, but without blood. It was amazing. So I was not
you
really
weren't
pleased.
you didn't write the
No.
Well, let's get into Owl Moon, shall we?
Okay.
What a wonderful honor for you this year, winning the Caldecott, that book winning the Caldecott Award and having written it, but such a sensitive story, and I know it comes from your family.
Yeah, my husband used to take the children out when they were younger, out owling. We've all gone bird watching with him all over the country, and in fact he's taking Heidi, who's the oldest, and Jason, who's the youngest. I'd say the oldest and the youngest. She's 22 and he's 18, down to Brazil this summer to go bird watching. And in fact, on the day that the announcement was made and then I got the phone call that Owl Moon had won the Caldecott, David and Heidi were bird watching in the Galapagos. Well, actually they were in a tropical rainforest. They were about to go to the Galapagos because it was part of a college course that she was taking.
So your husband wasn't even there to share the good news with you?
He was on the phone, and he and Heidi were doing what he and Heidi do in the book Owl Moon, except they weren't looking at owls, they were looking at very raucous, very bright-colored tropical birds.
Were you surprised, or were you...
I was knocked over.
Yeah.
I had 3 books out, 3 picture books out that year, Piggins and Three Bears Rhyme Book and Owl Moon. And Piggins and Three Bears Rhyme Book are both very splashy and bright and very quickly accessible to children of all ages. And Owl Moon is very quiet, very gentle, very internal, really, and had been turned down by 2 publishers who felt that it was too internal and too quiet and too gentle. I hope they're gnashing their teeth now.
They are, I'm sure they are.
And what John Schoenherr did with his illustrations was not only to show that gentle, quiet, lovingness in his illustrations, but he also did a wonderful sort of contrapuntal thing. He found something in the book that I'm not even sure I knew was there until he demonstrated it visually, which is that the people are never apart from nature. They are a part of nature, the father and the child, but they are a small part of nature. They are not imposed upon the landscape. They are not overwhelming the landscape. They are, in fact, a small part, an overwhelmed part of the landscape. You see them from nature is very large and they are very small so often. And in fact, the largest, the most forward part of that book is when you see that owl.
Yes.
And the owl
yes.
dominates
Yes.
the book visually as it should. And it becomes, I think, an experience for the child who's looking at the book.
It does.
The
it does,
domination
yes.
of that owl
The
filling
wing
the
spread,
full frame. Yeah.
the wing spread and everything. You know, it's funny. The children react completely to the quietness before they see the owl, and then the release after they've seen the owl. The kind of joyous, quiet, still release, but where she could talk and she could, you know, babble on or run or whatever. And
But she's still caught by the spell of the thing.
Yes.
Yeah. It was interesting. I had my choices already. In fact, I had dinner at some convention with my publisher and with one of the members of the Caldecott committee long before it was chosen. And I just babbled on and on about the books I thought should win the Caldecott. I never would mention Al Moon because I just didn't think it was in the running.
You weren't in that. You know, Jane, now that this has happened, why you've had so many things happening in your life this year, and this fall, would you tell us a little bit about what's in store for you this fall and with Harcourt, Brace, and Jovanovich?
Well, one of my publishers, I have many publishers, but one of them, Harcourt, Brace, Jovanovich, asked me to have my own imprint, which means I'm now editing books as well as writing them. I'm not going to be writing books for my imprint, but I will be editing between 5 and 7 books a year, starting, the first list will come out in 1990, which sounds an awful long way away, but in book terms, it's not. And that means I'll be choosing the authors, I'll be choosing the illustrators, I'll be working with them in the revision process, and then Harcourt, Brace, Jovanovich will be actually producing the books and selling the books. It's very exciting.
Oh, I'm sure it's exciting. Plus, writing yourself.
Oh, yeah, I'm not going to stop that.
What do you have in the works that you're writing?
Well,
I know you're excited about a book you're about to finish.
Well, that's an adult book, so we won't even talk about that.
Right.
But I have a companion book to Three Bears Rhyme book called Baby Bear's Bedtime Book. Jane Dyer will do the illustrations again, and actually Jane is this very minute finishing up the illustrations for the third Piggins book called Piggins and the Royal Wedding. And I have an Arthurian novel for children called The Dragon's Boy, which I am going to be writing. And I have a lot of picture books coming out over the next few years.
And you were mentioning you have some more fairy tales in your head that
I have
to come out.
I have a collection called Foxwife and Other Tales, which will be out next year.
Well, to wrap this up, Jane, would you kind of think a little bit about what you might advise young writers in the way of their, continuing with their creativity and
well, the only thing I could say is that I think there are 3 rules, if you will, for anyone who wants to be a writer. The first is you have to read, read, read. No question about it. That's first and foremost, because you have to love language, you have to love words. The second is you have to have a lot of patience and dedication. You can't just write something and expect it to be right the first time. So you have to do it over and over and over again. No teacher is going to be sitting over your shoulder saying to do it again. You have to be that teacher telling yourself to do it again. And the third thing is you have to have a really good sense of yourself, because there are a lot of people who will tell you it's no good, it'll never work, don't bother. And if you're going to be a writer, you have to feel that what you're writing is important to get down, whether anyone else ever reads it or not. You have to be the first reader, so you have to feel it's worth doing. So that's what I would tell them.
I think that's wonderful advice. We have a lot of children that are interested in writing, and they need to be encouraged, and I think those are the things. If they can just keep those things in mind, they'll be successful. It was nice having you with us. Very nice having you with us. And I'm sure that it's been informative to librarians and children alike. And I wish you well with your ventures, continued ventures. They sound so exciting. that they'll keep you young forever just trying to get everything all
Young
done.
or tired.
Or tired.
Forever.
Okay.
We appreciate Jane Yolen and Marland Schrauth's lively discussion and their willingness to visit us on All About Kids.
In this mystery, the butler didn't do it. In fact, Piggins, the butler, turns out to be the one who solves the mystery. Mr. and Mrs. Renard, some foxes, are having a dinner party to announce their intention to sell the lady fox's beautiful diamond lavalier necklace. They feel they must sell it because there appears to be a curse on it. As the guests arrive, Piggins, the butler, lets them in. Inspector Bayswater, a hound in a Sherlock Holmes outfit, arrives with his friend, Professor T. Ortis. Lord and Lady Ratsby enter after arguing with their carriage driver over the fare. Pierre Lapin and his 3 unmarried rabbit sisters arrive in their motor car. Well, all go into the dining room when Piggins announces that dinner is served. Mr. Renard tells everyone of the impending sale of the lavalier and its curse, and suddenly the lights go out. Well, when the lights come on again and order is restored, the necklace is missing. Lady Ratsby says, "Oh, perhaps the butler did it." Inspector Bayswater searches the room, and he finds a red thread near the door, crumbs of cheese on the table, a bit of dirt on the floor, but not the diamond lavalier. Piggins carefully restates the clues and also mentions the tinkling sound that was heard while the lights were off and the scream that preceded turning them on. From these clues and one red herring that Piggins explains away somewhat embarrassedly, the pig butler is able to solve this mystery. Piggins is a mystery that would be enjoyed by children in grades 2 and 3 and could be read to younger children as well. I think the adults reading the story to the children will also enjoy the illustrations, which are quite nicely designed. The book opens with a scene of Piggins going trit-trot up the stairs with the pot of tea for the dinner party. Next, we see a dollhouse-like scene of all the activity in the house before the party. The pictures during the story illustrate the action, and again we conclude with another dollhouse-like scene of the house shutting down for the night and Piggins coming trit-trot down the stairs with the teapot to have his own cup of tea after a satisfying day.
Piggins by Jane Yolen, reviewed by Laura Krentz, Children's Services Librarian at the Southdale Area Library, Edina, Minnesota. Thanks for joining us on All About Kids. Do join us again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.